A Boeing 747 with 524 people on board, flying at 24,000 feet, suddenly loses its tail in the air. The flight crew had no controls left and no direction. There was neither oxygen nor air pressure in the cabin. But even then, how they managed to keep the plane in the air for the next 45 minutes. This is a story of human willpower, engineering failure, and a flight where there was no form of control left. And that flight was Japan Air 123. Welcome back once again to Who Videos viewers. On August 12, 1985, a Boeing 747 of Japan Airlines was standing at Tokyo's Haneda Airport, disembarking passengers. Exactly 1 hour later, it had to take off again for Osaka. Thousands of people travel daily from Tokyo to Osaka, but today was an especially busy day because it was the Japanese holiday season, Obon, and people were heading to their hometowns. After cleaning, Japan Air 123 boarded 509 passengers and 15 crew members. For the crew, this was a routine flight, but the passengers had no idea that the plane they were boarding was suffering from a years-old weakness, a terrifying flaw, unknown to both pilots and the flight engineer. Due to a busy schedule, this particular Boeing 747 was going to complete its sixth flight of the day. Talking about the cockpit crew, 49-year-old Captain Masami Takahama was leading the flight, with 12,000 total flying hours. The first officer was 39-year-old Yutaka Sasaki, who was already in the process of being promoted to captain, and this flight was crucial for his promotion. He had a total of 3,900 flying hours. The third cockpit crew member was 46-year-old flight engineer Hiroshi Fukuda, whose job was to monitor the technical systems of the aircraft from behind the pilot's seats. Looking at the capabilities of the cockpit crew, one could say the lives of 509 passengers were in very safe hands. But just like the crew, was the aircraft also reliable? We'll find out very soon. At 6:04 p.m., the doors of Japan Air 123 were closed, and the pilots began taxiing the plane to runway 15L. The flight from Tokyo to Osaka was very short, just 1 hour and 12 minutes, meaning by the time the aircraft reached cruising altitude at 24,000 feet, it would already be time to prepare for descent. The weather in Tokyo was clear, but thunderstorms were forming in other parts of Japan that day, so the pilots were instructed not to fly directly to Osaka, but to travel over the ocean instead. Now at runway 15L, Japan Air 123 was fully ready for takeoff. At 6:12 p.m., after receiving permission from the control tower, the pilot pushed the thrust levers forward, and the plane successfully took off. Up to this point, everything was completely normal, but just 12 minutes after takeoff, above Sagami Bay, a mysterious sound came from inside the aircraft, and a hole suddenly appeared in the rear tail section. Passengers who were excited to be heading home saw their excitement turn into fear in the blink of an eye. Because of the hole, the cabin began filling with noise, and loose objects started getting sucked rapidly toward the hole. It all happened so fast it was difficult to even realize what had occurred. The sound was so loud it was heard in the cockpit as well. On the cockpit voice recorder, the sound was captured clearly. It's important to understand here. As the plane climbs, the outside air gets thinner and oxygen levels decrease. To counter this, artificial pressure is maintained inside the cabin, similar to atmospheric pressure at ground level. So at 24,000 feet, outside, pressure is low and cabin pressure is higher. This higher air pressure is constantly pushing outward on the cabin walls. The cabin is kept airtight to prevent any air leakage. But if even a small part of the cabin is weak, that internal air pressure can tear through it, creating a hole causing the cabin pressure to drop suddenly, and passengers can start feeling sick. Lack of oxygen can also make breathing difficult. This is exactly what happened on Japan Air 123. But the pilots still had no idea. They were heard on the cockpit voice recorder guessing that maybe a landing gear door had broken, or maybe the sound came from one of the engines. But the reality was, the rear section of the fuselage had detached from the plane, and with it, the rudder had also been torn off. Due to the tail's rupture, cabin pressure could no longer be maintained, and without the rudder, the plane was now out of the pilot's control. The rudder is the part located on the tail of the aircraft. Its detachment meant the aircraft could no longer be properly controlled by the pilots. The rudder controls the yaw movement of the aircraft, the left-right direction of the nose. When an aircraft turns, that movement is called roll. When the nose tilts up or down, it's called pitch. And when the nose moves left or right horizontally, it's called yaw. In simple words, at 24,000 feet, Japan Air 123 without a rudder could no longer make proper turns, nor could it align itself with the runway for landing. But even more dangerously, the pilots had no idea the rudder was gone. The plane was no longer stable and began swaying left and right on its own. This was something the autopilot could no longer handle. Down on the ground, someone saw the erratic movement of the plane and took a photo. In that photo, it was clearly visible that the rudder was missing from the tail. The pilots were still trying to understand the situation when the cabin crew could be heard making announcements, instructing passengers to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. Meanwhile, the captain realized something was seriously wrong, so he switched the transponder to frequency 7700, a universal distress signal. Now, all control towers would know that Japan Air 123 was in an emergency situation. The captain decided they should return and land back at Tokyo. But was the aircraft even capable of making it back? First, the captain informed the control tower of the emergency and requested permission to return to Tokyo. The control tower approved a 90-degree turn for return. The first officer, who was at the controls, turned the aircraft to the right, at a 40-degree angle, but the turn angle became much steeper than 40 degrees. At this point, the captain was heard yelling at the first officer to reduce the bank angle. But no matter what they did, the angle didn't reduce. The co-pilot kept trying, but the plane wasn't responding to any control input. Just then, the flight engineer informed both pilots that the hydraulic pressure was dropping rapidly, and within seconds, the hydraulic pressure dropped to 0. That was the moment when all three cockpit crew members realized the aircraft was now completely out of their control. For those who don't know, all the plane's controls, like ailerons for turning left or right, elevators for pitch control, and flaps for reducing speed, all of them are nearly impossible to move by hand when the plane is moving at over 1,000 kilometers per hour. That's why hydraulic pressure is used to operate them. The tail section that broke off had also torn through some of the hydraulic lines. This was the reason all hydraulic pressure was now lost, and the cockpit controls had become nothing more than decorative levers. At 24,000 feet, Japan Air 123 was now plagued with multiple issues. The cabin pressure had failed. Oxygen masks had deployed, the controls were useless due to the loss of hydraulics. And the most dangerous part, passengers and pilots were now experiencing hypoxia due to low pressure. Hypoxia is a condition where the oxygen level in the body drops, causing confusion, impaired decision-making, slowed movements, and can even lead to unconsciousness. The cabin crew was heard instructing everyone to put on oxygen masks. Japan Air 123, now severely rolling from side to side, was terrifying passengers with its erratic movements. The pilots were now left with only one form of control, the engine thrust controls. The captain tried to control the rolling of the aircraft using only engine thrust. To turn the plane to the right, they would increase thrust on the left engines. To turn left, they would increase thrust on the right engines. In a similar way, when the plane banged to the right, they would increase thrust only on the right engines temporarily to bring the plane level again. Using this technique, the pilots managed to gain some control over the rolling motion. Now their mission was just one: get the plane down and land at Tokyo as soon as possible. But first, they had to bring the plane to a lower altitude, so cabin pressure and oxygen levels could improve. Normally, this would be done using elevators, but they were now useless due to the hydraulic failure. So the captain came up with the idea to deploy the landing gear, which would create extra drag and help slow the aircraft down. Landing gears also use hydraulics to open, but this time, the captain hoped they could free fall open under their own weight. Fortunately, the landing gear deployed. At 6:45 p.m., Japan Air 123 made a wide circle over a city called Atsuki, and its altitude decreased from 24,000 feet to 13,500 feet. A huge achievement for the pilots. Cabin pressure and oxygen levels improved, but the danger still wasn't over. They had to take a right turn toward Tokyo from there, but turning the plane using only engine thrust was extremely difficult. Whenever they increased engine thrust, the nose of the plane would pitch upward, causing the speed to drop, and if the speed dropped too low, the plane could stall and fall from the sky. Reluctantly, the plane entered the mountainous region of Japan. At this low altitude, turning the plane toward Tokyo with no controls seemed nearly impossible. By 6:48 p.m., the captain was heard telling the first officer, "Make a right turn. There are mountains ahead." But making such a precise turn, using only engine controls, didn't seem possible. At this moment, various alarms were blaring in the cockpit. Despite all this, the aircraft continued to move toward the mountains, now at an altitude of just 6,800 feet. A few minutes later, at 6:54 p.m., the captain's panic was clearly evident in his voice. And then, just 2 minutes later, the following sounds were recorded in the cockpit. Japan Air 123, while trying to turn, collided with a mountain at low altitude. In this tragedy, only 4 people survived. Seated on the left side of the center cabin, the rest of the crew and passengers tragically lost their lives. Investigations revealed that 7 years earlier, during landing, the same plane's tail had collided with the runway. The aircraft was grounded for several weeks for repairs, and Boeing technicians worked on it during that time. The investigation showed that the technicians had improperly installed a splice plate on the tail. They calculated that this faulty repair could withstand only 11,000 pressure cycles, while Japan Air 123 had completed 12,500 cycles in this condition. Coincidentally, on this day, the pressure failed under the strain. After the crash, investigators put 4 different pilots into a flight simulator to simulate the same situation, but all 4 pilots crashed the plane. None of them were able to keep the plane in the air as long as Japan Air 123 had managed. This is a shocking fact because the pilots in the simulator had 2 significant advantages. They knew the issue beforehand, and they were aware their lives wouldn't be at risk. Given these conditions, it's clear that the pilots of Japan Air 123 tried their absolute best until the end to keep the plane in the air for 45 minutes. We hope you enjoyed this video from Wo. We appreciate all your likes and comments. Thank you so much, and we'll meet again in the next exciting video.